The rider's urgent news, it turned out, was nothing more than a courier confusing my seal with a lesser lord's. Sylvie's face when she realized the mistake was worth more than the interruption cost us. Both of us had braced for a crisis. What we got instead was a delivery mix-up. Her expression in that instant stayed with me longer than the letter itself. Her shoulders had dropped an inch. Then her mouth had twitched toward a laugh she refused to let out. I told her to sit back down. What I had been about to say deserved her full attention. It did not deserve the leftover nerves of a false alarm. She smoothed her skirts and folded her hands in her lap. She composed herself the way she always did before I gave her something worth writing down. I waited until her breathing evened out before I started again. The southern border, I said, was not the end of my map. It was the scene where the real profit began. Beyond the Orc War stalemate on the southern front sat the southern kingdoms. I had spent more nights than I would admit staring at trade ledgers instead of sleeping, thinking about them. The candle on my desk had burned down to nothing more times than I could count. I traced supply routes on the map with a fingertip until the wax pulled cold. They were stable, and stability meant no war profiteering to exploit. They were wealthy, and wealth meant no desperate populations begging for grain at inflated prices. But they were starving for exactly one thing Greywood happened to produce in embarrassing surplus. Luxury. Glass. Refined sugar. Dyed cloth. Preserved delicacies out of season. The kind of goods that made southern nobility believe they had bought a piece of the divine. The problem was political, not commercial. I told Sylvie plainly that Greywood had no foothold there. No treaty. No ambassador. No leverage of any kind. Except one institution recognized no border at all. That institution was already under construction in my own territory. The Cathedral of Holy Light, I explained, was never just a monument to piety. It was a passport. A caravan traveling under the church's banner, delivering supplies to a cathedral, escorting missionaries on some sanctioned errand of faith, crossed borders that merchant caravans bled gold just to approach. No southern lord wanted his name attached to turning away the church. Not when the word heretic could undo 3 generations of careful marriage alliances. So the tithe, the cathedral, the nuns, the whole architecture of my reputation as a devout young lord. All of it was infrastructure, dressed in incense and stained glass. I watched Sylvie's pen slow as she wrote that down. She wanted to make certain she had the words exactly right. Sylvie asked, carefully, whether I had told this to anyone else. I said only her. A passport works only as long as no one suspects it was minted by the traveler. I also explained the 20% of Nightingale's shares I had handed to Duke Ace's family. She had raised an eyebrow at that decision weeks ago. She had never gotten a real answer out of me. It was not generosity. It was not even really a partnership. It was a signal sent in the only language dukes trust, which is equity. Ace needed to see, in writing, backed by coin, that Serena's guild had no interest in gnawing at Golden Eagle's empire-wide roots. Our ambitions pointed south, past the border into markets Golden Eagle had never touched. That made us allies by geography before we were ever allies by choice. A rival who believes your knife is pointed elsewhere stops sharpening his own. When I finished, I fed the letter that had started the evening's false alarm into the fireplace. I watched the wax seal blacken and curl before the paper caught. The flame ate through the false lord's name first. It was as if the fire agreed the name had never mattered. It had not mattered in the end. But some habits of caution outlived the threats that created them. I stood at the window after that, looking south past the dark line of the border. The glass had gone cold under my palm. Beyond it the town lights sat in neat rows like coals banked for the night. I had the particular satisfaction of a man who has already placed his bet, and is only waiting for the table to pay out. Serena was still days from arriving with whatever she had salvaged from the capital. The missionary group was already somewhere on the road, closer than either of us knew. I would not see their journey with my own eyes. But I collected the account afterward the way I collected everything else. Patiently. From multiple sources. Until the shape of it was whole. Burns' patrol logs gave me the border crossing. Father Cantrell's own later admissions, dropped in unguarded moments over the following weeks, gave me the rest. Cantrell was a middle-aged priest who had spent 15 years in the capital church as furniture. Present at every ceremony. Promoted nowhere. Trusted with nothing larger than record-keeping. His appointment as the first parish priest of the new Cathedral of Holy Light in Greywood was, by his own later account, the first assignment of his career that anyone had bothered to frame as an opportunity rather than an obligation. He traveled with 3 nuns assigned to establish the cathedral's charitable presence. I found their differences instructive even secondhand. Valerie was young and curious in the unguarded way of someone who has not yet been disappointed enough times to stop asking questions. Helen was older, composed, and carried the particular fatigue of a woman who had seen enough provincial postings to expect very little from this one. Lillian sat somewhere between the two of them. She was the one who mattered most to my accounting, because she had heard things. Refugees passing through the capital had talked, in the disjointed way refugees talk, about a northern territory where bread was free. Where meat found its way into soup bowls that used to hold water. Where winter vegetables grew despite the season. Where the poor burned fuel that gave off no smoke. Lillian had filed all of it under exaggeration, the way any reasonable person would. The caravan traveled half a month by covered wagon. The cold worsened with every mile north. Canvas walls did little against wind that found every seam. Cantrell's fingers had gone stiff around the reins somewhere past the first week. No amount of flexing them warmed the joints back up. By the time they reached my border checkpoint, Cantrell later admitted the cold had stopped being an inconvenience. It had become the only thing any of them could think about. Then Valerie saw it first. She pointed through a gap in the canvas at something none of them had a word for. An expanse of white stretched across the horizon, too regular to be snow, too extensive to be anything they recognized. Row after row of glass and timber structures caught the weak winter light. None of them knew they were looking at greenhouses. Nothing in their experience of the world had prepared them to expect vegetables growing under glass in the dead of winter. I confess I take a certain pleasure in that detail. The greenhouses were never meant merely to feed my people. They were meant to be seen and disbelieved by exactly this kind of traveler. The checkpoint stop was routine on my end, which is to say Byrne ran it exactly as I had trained him to. Byrne was an Iron Guard patrol captain, a scarred face over a patient temperament. He was the kind of soldier who could be terrifying or courteous depending entirely on what the situation required. He confirmed the caravan's papers, the church's seal, and Cantrell's appointment letter. Once satisfied, his manner shifted into something almost warm. He told them to go on ahead. He added, in the dry way Byrne delivers everything, that they should take a good look around, because it would surely surprise them. Cantrell told me later he had assumed that was a border guard's idle courtesy, the kind of thing said to travelers everywhere. He had no framework yet for a soldier who understated things on purpose. The road beyond the checkpoint did the rest of the work Byrne had not bothered to. Greenhouses stood in neat rows, vegetables green and upright behind glass while frost sat undisturbed on the ground outside. Farmland beyond them was plowed in straight, disciplined lines, waiting out the winter under a light dusting of snow. It was clearly tended rather than abandoned. Then came the housing. 2-story buildings in red brick. Real glass in every window. Chimneys drawing smoke in orderly columns rather than the choking haze Cantrell associated with poor districts. A mechanical clock tower rose over the town center. Its hands moved with a precision that had nothing to do with sundials or guesswork. Cantrell admitted he had stared at it long enough that Helen finally had to tug his sleeve to get the wagon moving again. Townspeople moved through the streets in a way Cantrell found difficult to name at first. Only later did he identify it correctly. They looked unafraid. Not defiant. Not proud. Just unafraid, the way people look when the next disaster is not something they are constantly bracing for. Children ran between buildings playing some game with a ball of tied rags. Their laughter was loud enough to carry, which told me more than any patrol report could. Women stood in doorways trading gossip and actual laughter. It was the kind that comes from people who have enough left over in a day to spend some of it on each other. Then the caravan passed a construction site. This was the detail Cantrell dwelled on longest in his later retelling. A crew of orc laborers worked a drainage ditch, shirtless despite the cold, muscles working in rhythm as they cut through frozen ground. A human foreman stood beside them with a set of blueprints, pointing out grade and depth. He discussed the work the way any foreman discusses work with a crew he expects competence from. No whips. No chain. No guards standing over them with spears. Cantrell had spent his whole life in a world where orcs were something you fought, feared, or enslaved. None of those categories accounted for what he was watching. He described it to me later as the moment his understanding of how the world worked stopped applying, with nothing yet ready to replace it. Valerie, riding beside him, asked in a small and frightened voice whether they had taken a wrong road somewhere. She wondered if they had arrived at some place they were not meant to be. Cantrell told her no, they had come to exactly the right place. They only needed to learn the world again, he said, because apparently they had been carrying the wrong map of it their whole lives. I read that line in Burns' later paraphrase and thought it was the single most useful sentence Cantrell would say all week. He had no idea yet how useful. A priest who arrives already unlearning his assumptions is a priest who reports honestly to his bishop. Honest reports, aimed correctly, are worth more to me than 100 loyal liars. The caravan continued into the town proper, and the details kept accumulating. Cantrell later confessed it had started to feel less like observation and more like an argument he could not win. The road itself was stone, smooth and fitted, without the ruts or standing mud he expected even in the capital's better districts after a rain. Cast iron lampposts lined the street at even intervals. If you looked closely, you could see the lamp mechanisms themselves, along with pipes running beneath the surface, towards some source none of the missionaries could identify. Ordinary townspeople greeted the church carriage as it passed. The greeting was warmth rather than the stiff, obligatory reverence Cantrell was used to receiving in the capital, where a priest's blessing was accepted the way a toll is paid. Further in they passed a public canteen. This was the second detail that unsettled Cantrell as much as the orc laborers had. A line of workers stood outside it, ordinary laborers in work clothes. They were not the gallant, desperate crowds that gathered around charity kitchens in the capital. They were talking, joking, one of them laughing hard enough to double over. None of it carried the shame Cantrell associated with standing in a bread line. This was not charity being administered to the desperate. It read, plainly as lunch, the same unremarkable errand as any other daily habit. Cantrell noticed, and later named for me directly, the thing that was missing from every face around him. No exhaustion sitting behind the eyes. No numbness in how people moved. No hunch in the shoulders that comes from years of expecting to be struck, cheated, or ignored. He had cataloged poverty his whole career by exactly those signs. Here there was nothing to catalog. Then the caravan slowed near a courtyard where a crowd had gathered. Helen was the first to recognize the woman at the center of it. It was Cecilia. All three nuns went quiet at once in a way that told its own story before anyone said a word. Cecilia had vanished from the capital's account of things back in spring. That was after Bishop Macbeth's investigation into rumors of heresy in the north wrapped up, and he returned home without her. Nobody at the capital church had known what became of her. The silence had been filled, as silences are, with the worst available guesses. Here she was instead very much alive. She knelt in the cold to bind a townsman's injured hand with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Cantrell decided, without much deliberation, that he was going to go say hello. The nuns fell in behind him. Cecilia looked up before they had fully crossed the courtyard. Whatever she felt on seeing them arrived on her face immediately, with nothing held back or arranged for effect. She was happy, plainly and unself-consciously happy. It was the way people are happy when a worry they had stopped voicing turns out to have been unnecessary. She welcomed them to Greywood before Cantrell had gotten out a single formal greeting. The townspeople around her, sensing an occasion, closed in around the whole group. Gifts came from every direction at once. A loaf of bread pressed into her hands. A hand-knitted scarf draped over her shoulders by a woman who refused to hear any protest. A jar of pickled vegetables set at her feet by a child too shy to hand it over directly. None of it was owed to her in any formal sense. None of it was offered as tribute to her office. It was payment unspoken and entirely sincere for years of small unremarkable kindnesses. A house call in the middle of the night. A wound treated for a family that could not pay. A door that never once closed on someone who needed it open. Cantrell told me later that he had never in his career seen a clergy member handled with this much informality, or this much affection. The two things together struck him as almost contradictory. In his experience, reverence and warmth rarely traveled in the same direction. In the capital, Cecilia had been regarded as an oddity. Generous past the point anyone found comfortable, a minor embarrassment tolerated rather than admired. Here the same generosity had apparently curdled into something the whole town treated as an open debt they were delighted to keep paying down. The townspeople pushed their gifts on her and joked with her in the same breath. They refused every half-hearted attempt she made to wave the offerings off. She gave up trying after the second scarf appeared. When the crowd had thinned enough to speak privately, Cantrell finally asked how she had ended up here of all places. He asked whether she was well. Cecilia answered him plainly, without a trace of the performance clergy usually reserve for reporting their own well-being upward. She told him she was doing very, very well here. Nothing more elaborate than that, because nothing more elaborate was needed. I have turned that report over more than once since Byrne and Cantrell each supplied their halves of it. I recognize good propaganda when it lands in my lap without my having spent a coin to arrange it. A beloved nun, genuinely beloved, welcoming the capital's own missionaries into a town that feeds its poor at a counter instead of a charity line. In front of witnesses who owe me nothing and were told to say nothing. That is worth more to my reputation than the 50,000 silver I send Bishop Macbeth every month. I doubt Cantrell ever understood how carefully the ground he walked on had been prepared for exactly this reaction. That too was part of the design. A man who believes he has stumbled onto the truth argues for it harder than a man who suspects he has been shown it. I set the pen down and let the ink dry before I closed the ledger on that day's accounting. Some victories look like nothing more than a priest walking down a street and drawing the wrong conclusions on his own. Those are the ones I trust most. Cantrell would carry that afternoon back into every letter he wrote to the capital for months afterward, and he would not be exaggerating a single word of it, which was, of course, precisely the point. I stood at my office window the next morning with a cup of black coffee cooling in my hand. Steam had already stopped rising off it by the time I noticed. The cup had gone the temperature of the room, which told me exactly how long I had been standing there. My fingers had gone stiff around the handle without my permission. Outside, the light was still the flat gray of early morning, not yet warmed into anything useful. I watched the road that fed into the government district. Dust from the previous day's traffic still hung low over the ruts. A cart wheel had carved a fresh groove near the crossing, and no one had bothered to fill it yet. I counted minutes by the angle of the sun instead of a clock. Clocks in this town were still a luxury item, and I hadn't gotten around to putting one in every office that needed it. That was a gap in the infrastructure I intended to close before winter, not a permanent condition. I made a note to raise it with the engineers before the season turned. I had timed the caravan's route the night before. I marked every landmark it would pass on a strip of paper I kept folded in my coat pocket. The ink had smeared where my thumb kept worrying at the same crease. I did not need the paper anymore by that point, but I kept touching it anyway. Old habits die slower than the reasons that built them. A good investment gets monitored the same way a bad one does. Closely and without sentiment. I had learned that lesson before I had the title to go with it. Sylvie came in without knock. That alone told me the report was good before she said a word. She only remembered her manners when she had bad news to soften. Her boots still carried road dust from wherever she had come from in a hurry. She said the convoy was running on schedule. She said it was cutting through the market district exactly when I predicted it would. She said one of the nuns had nearly pitched herself off the carriage bench craning her neck at the greenhouse rows. I found that more satisfying than I probably should have. I pictured the woman's veil catching the wind. I pictured her knuckles going white on the carriage rail as she leaned too far. I could not entirely suppress the satisfaction of it. Some pleasures are cheap enough that I do not bother denying myself them. Then she mentioned the caravan had stopped entirely near the staff hospital. Father Cantrell had recognized Cecilia among the healers standing on the steps. I set my cup down on the windowsill. The porcelain clicked against the stone louder than I expected. Sylvie waited a beat before continuing, reading something in my face I had not meant to show. I asked how long they stopped for. Long enough, Sylvie said, for half the missionary party to climb out of their seats and stare. I told her that single stop was worth more to me than anything I could have staged in this office. No amount of rehearsal produces that particular expression on a stranger's face. A priest can be told 100 times that a Bohemia exile runs an honest town. He can file that away as a rumor to be verified later. Most of them do exactly that. Paper claims get filed away with every other unverified rumor a traveling priest collects. The same priest, watching a woman he once knew as a ruined heretic stand respected and unafraid in front of strangers, cannot file that away as anything but true. I could hand Cantrell every ledger in this building. It would buy me less trust than one unscripted minute on a public street. So I told Sylvie to hold the formal reception until the following morning. Let them return to whatever guesthouse we had arranged for them. Let them lie awake replaying every impossible thing they had seen that day. Let the doubt do its work on them without my help. A man who has slept badly on a strange idea wakes up half convinced of it. His mind spent the night failing to argue it away. Exhaustion does the rest. I have never once needed to argue a point that a sleepless night could argue for me. With that settled, I moved to the problem that actually kept me up nights. It had nothing to do with priests. The relief shipments into the territory we had absorbed from the former Baron White River and the former Baron Oakoven were holding, for now. For now was the phrase that mattered, and I never let myself forget it was doing the work. Grain carts and blankets solve this month's problem. They create next year's problem if nothing follows them. Those villages needed seed stock suited to their own soil. They needed greenhouses of their own, not permanent dependency on convoys from Greywood. Dependency looks like generosity right up until the convoy is late one season. Our own greenhouse expansion was only in its third phase. I was not willing to strip resources from my own people to subsidize someone else's harvest indefinitely. Charity that bankrupts the one giving it is not charity, it is a slower kind of failure wearing a kinder face. I had watched men mistake the two before, and I did not intend to join them. Which was exactly why the southern trade route mattered more than any single relief shipment ever could. Cotton, iron ore, leather, and food surplus sat south of us in quantities that made our current shortages look almost decorative. I intended to pay for every bit of it with kerosene lamps and steel tools. Good enough tools, in fact, that southern nobles would come to consider Greywood goods a habit they could not break. An addiction to convenience is the cheapest leash I know how to build. It never needs tightening by force. It tightens itself, one satisfied customer at a time. Cantrell, I learned later, did not sleep much that night. A man can absorb one impossible thing in an evening and call it a fluke. He cannot absorb an entire town of them and call it anything but a reordering of his worldview. The candle in his guesthouse room, I am told, burned down to nothing before dawn. In the morning, a young liaison officer named Alan came to walk him to the government building. I am told the priest asked more questions on that short walk than he had asked in all of the previous day combined. Alan answered most of them without checking his stride. They passed a streetlight where a child stood on tiptoe, topping off the oil reservoir. The child worked through the motion with the boredom of someone doing an assigned chore, rather than a miracle. Alan mentioned, when Cantrell asked, that the task rotated between neighboring households on a fixed schedule. He compared it to the way anyone might take a turn sweeping a shared stair. Cantrell apparently repeated the comparison back to himself, testing whether it held. Near the clock tower, a knot of off-shift workers stood trading gossip and complaints about a foreman. Someone laughed loudly enough to startle a pair of roosting pigeons off the tower ledge. The birds circled once and settled again 3 rooftops down. They were ordinary and unremarkable in every way that mattered. Cantrell apparently found that detail more unsettling than the greenhouses themselves. Miracles are supposed to announce themselves, in his experience. This one had not. This town had folded its miracles into the rhythm of an unremarkable morning instead. I received him in a reception room I had chosen for the light. Dust hung visible in the shaft of morning sun crossing the table, and I let it hang there. A sunlit room makes a man more inclined to trust what he is told in it. I had learned that particular trick from watching how badly lit rooms make people lie. I kept the conversation direct. Cantrell struck me as someone who would read courtesy as evasion if I let a meeting run long on pleasantries. I unrolled the blueprint I had drawn up weeks earlier. The paper had been rolled so long it fought to curl back up under my palms. I had it drawn before I had even confirmed the mission was coming. I do not wait for certainty to start preparing for probability. Certainty is a luxury I extend to no one, least of all myself. The plot I offered sat near the main street. 350 meters by 230 meters, among the better locations left in the town. The design accounted for dormitories, a canteen, and a pharmacy alongside the cathedral itself. I was not interested in funding a building that could not also feed and treat the people who used it. A cathedral with no pharmacy attached is a monument, not an institution. Cantrell's gratitude showed plainly enough on his face. His fingers traced the outline of the pharmacy wing twice before he looked back up at me. I moved past it to the one condition I actually cared about. I told him I wanted his missionaries laying the foundation stones themselves. Hauling the rock, raising the walls with their own hands, not standing at a safe distance issuing instructions to hired labor. I explained that in my experience, a person only calls a place home once they have bled a little sweat into its foundation. That includes the clergy who will one day stand at that altar and tell a congregation that this town looks after its own. I watched something in Cantrell's face settle at that. It was not agreement so much as recognition. It was the look of a man matching a stranger's claim against something he had already seen with his own eyes. I suspect he was thinking of Cecilia on those hospital steps. I suspect he was wondering what it must have cost her, or given her, to belong somewhere the way she now clearly did. He agreed without negotiating the point. That told me he understood exactly what I was offering him, and what I expected in return. We shook hands over the blueprint. His grip was firmer than I expected from a man who had spent the previous day looking faintly lost. I considered the morning's business concluded to my satisfaction. I rolled the blueprint back up myself once he had gone, out of a habit I never bothered breaking. What follows next did not happen in front of me, and I want to be honest about that before I describe it. I was in Greywood the entire time. I read it later in intelligence dispatches, and the kind of gossip that travels along trade roads faster than official couriers ever manage. I have pieced the sequence together from 3 separate informants. Their accounts agreed closely enough that I trust the shape of it. I cannot vouch for every exact word spoken, only for the pattern beneath the words. At the south gate of the capital, a procession returned from the southern front. It bore no resemblance to the army that had marched out under that banner 2 years earlier. The banner itself, I am told, had been reduced to a strip of faded cloth barely worth calling a flag. At its head rode Arthur Bohemia, once the golden eldest son the whole capital had toasted at his departure. He was sun-scarred and thin now. He held himself upright on a starved horse through what must have been pure stubbornness. The horse itself looked in no better condition than the men trailing behind it. Beside him rode our mother Stephanie, in a patchwork-covered wagon that looked cobbled together from whatever canvas had survived the retreat. She was feeding Arthur dry bread with hands that would not stop shaking. Behind them came what remained of an army that had once numbered in the thousands. Some 30 soldiers, by the counts I received, all that survived to walk back through that gate. I will not pretend I feel nothing reading that number. I will also not pretend the arithmetic does not interest me almost as much as the grief does. Both reactions are honest, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort. Arthur had gone south 2 years before with elite troops and a fortune drawn from the family coffers. He had expected the kind of glory that gets carved into family portraits. The Orc front gave him nothing of the sort. The reports reaching the capital had undersold the brutality of that war by a wide margin, by every account I have since gathered. And once our father lost his political struggle, the sabotage started arriving disguised as ordinary supply failures. Spears that shattered on first contact instead of holding an edge. Arrow shipments that failed to arrive, quietly and repeatedly, until no one could call it coincidence anymore. Shields riddled with rot beneath a fresh coat of paint. Rations cut with sand, discovered only after men had already eaten it. Arthur became convinced, and I have no reason to doubt him on this point, that Duke Golden Lion's faction was engineering every one of those failures from a safe distance. For 3 months he had kept written records of it. Dates, quantities, the names of the quartermasters who signed off on shipments that never should have passed inspection. He believed that evidence, placed directly in the Emperor's hands, was the one lever left that could expose the Duke. The one lever that could drag our family's name back out of the mud. I understand that hope intimately. I have never once let myself indulge in a version of it that depends on someone else's mercy. Hope aimed at another person's conscience is a debt you cannot collect on your own schedule. Arthur was nursing an entire future built on the assumption that reaching the capital would change something. It did not occur to him, I think, that the capital might have already decided his fate before his boots touched its stone. Capitals rarely wait for the accused to arrive before reaching a verdict. At the gate, Arthur presented the Bohemia crest the way any returning nobleman would. He expected the standard courtesies that crest was supposed to guarantee him. The guards stalled him instead of waving him through. One of them, I am told, would not even meet his eyes while he spoke. That should have told him everything. I doubt he let himself read it that plainly in the moment. Hope has a way of talking a man out of the plainest evidence in front of him. A full company of Imperial Guards marched out shortly after. They closed around his ragged remnant before a single one of his men had the strength left to object with anything more than words. An officer read out an imperial decree charging Arthur with treason. The charge was abandoning his post and withdrawing from the front without orders. The decree named him, our mother, and the immediate family for arrest pending trial. No distinction was made for the state any of them had returned in. The wording, from what I have heard, was almost bureaucratic in its indifference. Arthur tried to raise his sabotage records. He tried to explain the spears and the arrows and the sand in the rations. The officer did not so much reject the argument as fail to acknowledge it existed at all. He was told plainly to surrender his weapon. The alternative was stated as summary execution on the spot. Arthur looked at his own men. Unarmed, starved, in no condition to make this a fight. He looked at the ring of halberds closing around them. He understood there was no version of this moment where refusing accomplished anything. He unbuckled his sword. He let it drop. I am told it struck the paving stones with a flat, unremarkable sound. The kind of sound that would not turn a single head on an ordinary day. In my own accounting, that sound was the last of the Bohemia pride finally giving out. No trumpet, no crowd, just metal against stone in a street that had already moved on. Arthur and our mother were taken down into the imperial court's underground dungeon. They were placed in separate cells. I imagine that was its own particular cruelty, denying them even each other's company in that state. Everything on Arthur's person was confiscated as a matter of routine. That included the one bundle of papers he had risked his life keeping intact through 2 years of hostile territory. 3 months of evidence against Duke Golden Lion, gone into some clerk's storage crate without a second glance from anyone who processed it. 2 years of risk reduced to an unlabeled crate in an evidence room nobody would open again. In the cell beside his, our mother had cried herself past the point of open hysteria. She had settled into a quieter, worn-down sobbing that apparently did not stop for hours. She kept insisting, through it, that Serena would never abandon them. She kept insisting that word of their capture would reach her, and she would surely come to intervene. I find it difficult to know what to do with that particular detail. Serena was, at that exact hour, safely inside my territory drinking tea I had personally arranged for her. The tea, if I recall the household ledger correctly, was a decent southern blend, nothing extravagant. It cost me a fraction of what our mother's faith in her cost our mother that night. An officer came to Arthur's cell sometime after. He delivered the rest of the news with the flat indifference of a man reading a shipping manifest. Intelligence had confirmed that Serena fled the capital half a month earlier. She had taken every liquid asset Nightingale possessed with her. She had taken refuge in the territory of her exiled brother. The useless third son, in the officer's own words, though I understand the phrase was not meant as flattery to me. I have been called worse by better men, and I outlasted every one of them. The label never bought its owners anything they got to keep. Our mother, overhearing through the bars, broke down entirely. She refused outright to believe any of it could be true. Arthur sat in silence through all of it. I think that silence tells me more about him than anything he said before or after. A man who has run out of arguments has usually run out of illusions along with them. If I had the standing and the resources to shelter Serena the moment she needed shelter, then whatever I had built up here was real. Not the exile's consolation prize everyone in the capital assumed it to be. And Arthur, who had been given the elite troops, the family fortune, and every advantage a firstborn son could ask for, had managed to lose all of it in under 3 years. Every advantage he was handed turned out to buy him nothing durable in the end. I will not claim I take no satisfaction at all in that particular reversal. That would be a lie I am not interested in telling myself. But I also did not go looking for this outcome. There is a difference, however thin, between profiting from a collapse and having engineered it. I intend to keep standing on the correct side of that line, even when no one else bothers to check where I am standing. Arthur, as far as I can tell, spent that night in the dark doing the one piece of arithmetic our family had never taught him how to do. The kind of arithmetic where you count what is left after everything you assumed was permanent turns out not to be. I have done that arithmetic myself on colder floors than the one he was given. Somewhere above him the capital would already be moving on to its next piece of gossip, indifferent to the math he was doing in the dark. The city has never once paused for a family it decided to discard. I doubt he liked the answer any better than I once disliked being handed the exact same lesson, years earlier, on my own way out of that same capital. Word came in through 3 separate informants. 3 sources, 3 different mouths, and none of them knew about the others. That mattered, because it meant Duke Golden Lion believed the story he was telling himself even before I confirmed a line of it. A man who trusts 3 sources equally has usually stopped checking any of them. He wants agreement more than he wants accuracy. Most men do, once the alternative is admitting they guessed wrong in front of witnesses. I keep that observation filed away for my own habits too. Arthur sat in a cell. The stone around him would have been cold enough by now to remind him of everything he used to take for granted. Stone does not care what a man used to own. No servant to warm the room for him this time. No title on the door to soften the guard's manners. The Bohemia name lay in the mud, or so he thought. From where he stood, the whole board looked cleared for him. A cleared board is the most dangerous illusion a losing man can afford himself. I imagine he allowed himself a private toast to that thought at least once. Men in his position always drink to victories that haven't finished arriving yet. The wine goes down easier than the accounting that comes after. He had spent the past weeks leaning on the business alliance. He pushed quietly for a formal ban on Golden Eagle's new lines. The kerosene lamps, the smokeless fuel, the steel tools. Anything that kept undercutting his candle ledgers earned a place on that list. A ban costs nothing to propose and everything to enforce. That is exactly why men like him love proposing them. He nearly had the votes lined up. Then his own butler came through the study door at a dead run. For a man that particular, a run through his own study door is itself a piece of intelligence. I picture the ink still wet on whatever document Golden Lion had been signing when the door banged open. The pen must have skidded, leaving a line across the page he'd never bother to explain to anyone. A ruined signature tells its own small story to whoever finds it later. Outside the Business Alliance headquarters, a crowd had gathered. Tenant farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with artisans. Street vendors filled the gaps between them. A scatter of minor noble stewards stood among the rest, watching with a different kind of nervousness. Their kind of nervousness comes from calculating which side wins before deciding where to stand. It is a skill I respect more than loyalty, since it is honest about its own motives. Well past 1,000 bodies, by the count my informant gave me. I trust that count more than I trust most tax registers. Registers can be edited after the fact. A crowd that size cannot. Signs went up first. Then the voices rose to match them. The noise of it must have carried past the district gates. A threat passed hand to hand through the crowd, repeated until it sounded like a fact rather than a rumor. They would march on the cathedral itself, the whisper said, if their new lamps and tools were confiscated. A rumor that travels that cleanly through 1,000 strangers rarely travels on its own legs. Someone feeds a rumor like that, and someone else times its release. Timing is the part most people forget to admire. I would like to know which hand fed this one. I suspect I already do. Golden Lion rode out to see it with his own eyes. I respect that decision, because most men in his position would have trusted a report and been wrong twice over. He looked at 1,000 ordinary faces holding signs in front of watching nobility. He understood, correctly, that no soldier under his command could touch them without costing him more than the ban was worth. He turned his carriage around. The wheels on cobblestone must have sounded like a verdict to anyone watching from the crowd. Retreat has a sound of its own, and a crowd learns to recognize it fast. That single decision told me his instincts were still sound, even if his information underneath them was not. An instinct without accurate information is a compass without a map. It still points somewhere. It just doesn't point where the man holding it thinks it does. By evening, someone slipped out the back entrance of Business Alliance headquarters carrying a sealed letter. The wax seal alone would have told a careful observer the matter carried weight. The letter said the ban was suspended pending further investigation. Further investigation is a phrase bureaucracies use when they want a problem to age quietly rather than die loudly. Duke Ace read his copy by candlelight. That detail came from the servant who watched him do it. I wonder sometimes whether Ace chooses candlelight on purpose, for the theater of it, or whether he prefers it on its own merits. Either answer would tell me something useful about him. He burned the page once he had finished with it. He burned it with the kind of care a man uses when he wants to be seen enjoying something. Wax dripped somewhere near his elbow, according to the servant, and he did not bother to wipe it away. A small carelessness, deliberately left in place for an audience. He murmured, so the servant claims, that Golden Lion had finally met an opponent his ledgers could not out-argue. Then he looked north, toward Greywood. He understood before anyone else in the capital that the real contest was never going to be settled in a Business Alliance meeting room. I read that report twice. On the second pass, I decided Ace was worth every silver I paid to keep him comfortable in his position. A rival who studies the correct battlefield is more dangerous than one who studies me. Ace has always studied the battlefield. That is a rarer discipline than it sounds, in a capital full of men who study only each other. The next report reached me 2 days later. It explained why Ace had gone quiet after the letter instead of pressing his advantage in the capital. He had personally escorted 3 of the Business Alliance's heaviest hitters north. Vice Chairman Justin Hall rode with him. So did the Permit Deacon Beatrice Clare. So did Old Crawford of the Imperial Foundry Guild. 3 witnesses, each carrying a different kind of authority, chosen for exactly that reason. He took them away from the capital, and away from Greywood both. Their destination was Oakhaven and White River. Those territories carry a puppet baron's seal on paper. Underneath that seal, on everything that matters, they carry my signature instead. Paper answers to whoever bothers to read it closely enough. Golden Lion heard the itinerary and understood immediately what it was built to prove. If the new products could be traced to legitimate noble territory, rather than to a stripped house with no standing left to speak of, then his case collapsed. Every accusation he had been building against Greywood lost its foundation in a single tour. He moved fast once he saw it. He drafted a petition to the Emperor, meant to nail the guilt to the Bohemian name before Ace's convoy could return with a clean verdict. Speed is a virtue I admire in an opponent. I admire it right up until it arrives a step behind mine. By then his petition was already chasing a version of events that no longer existed. Ink dries the same whether the argument beneath it is still standing or not. The same night Ace's convoy left the capital, another piece moved into place. A bishop whose name my informant could not confirm sent a quiet message to the Business Alliance through church channels. The message noted, without drama, that the funds building the Cathedral of Holy Light traced back to my own donation. It added that a patron of that scale deserved to have his legitimacy respected, rather than questioned in the middle of a merchant dispute. No name was attached to Greywood in the message. None needed to be. Everyone reading it understood which house the church had chosen to stand behind. I never asked Bishop Macbeth to send that letter. I never needed to. 50,000 silver a month buys a man's genuine belief that I am the most devout patron the church has produced in a generation. Genuine belief moves faster than any instruction I could have written myself. Instruction requires obedience, and obedience always hesitates at the edges. Belief does not hesitate at all. It writes its own letters and signs its own name to them. That is the cheapest army I have ever fielded. Golden Lion received both pieces of news within the same hour, by every account. He broke a teacup against his own study wall in response. I keep that detail in the report. It tells me more about his state of mind than any spy report on troop movements ever could. A man who breaks porcelain over a letter he cannot even trace to a source has already lost the argument in his own head. Porcelain is an expensive thing to sacrifice to a feeling, and he must have known it even as he threw it. The shards would have sat on that floor until a servant worked up the nerve to sweep them. I picture him staring at the cracked wall afterward, wondering how a man who owns half the candle trade in this city keeps losing to shadows. A cracked wall stays cracked long after the anger that made it fades. 2 days after leaving the capital, Ace's convoy reached the Okivan factory complex. My informant's description of the 3 officials' faces on arrival was worth the fee alone. Rows of brick buildings stood in disciplined lines. Water wheels turned steadily against the current. The sound of them must have carried across the whole valley floor. Production lines moved with the kind of order that no puppet baron's administration could invent on its own. I built that complex myself. I staffed it with skilled workers transferred quietly out of Greywood. I dressed the whole operation in enough legitimate paperwork to survive a hostile audit. Every stamp, every signature, every dated receipt had been sitting in a drawer for longer than the visit itself took to arrange. Preparation, done early enough, stops looking like preparation and starts looking like history. Crawford is the sort of old craftsman who trusts his hands over any ledger. He picked up a forged steel hoe from the finishing line. He turned it over twice. The weight of it against his palm must have told him something no document could. Then he asked what alloy produced that edge. Ace did not answer the question directly. A shrewd man never answers a question he can redirect instead. He offered Crawford full access to the production records at his leisure. That sounds generous right up until you notice the records were prepared exactly for a visit like this one. Generosity, offered at the right moment, closes more doors than it opens. Justin and Beatrice moved through the assembly floor. They watched kerosene lamp components go together piece by piece from raw stock. That answered the only question they had actually come to ask. They asked for paperwork and received it. Purchase contracts, sales ledgers, guild licenses. Every document traced a path that held under scrutiny. It held because I had built the path myself years before anyone thought to check it. A lie that requires improvisation always cracks eventually. A lie built into the foundation before anyone starts asking questions simply becomes the record. The two are indistinguishable to anyone arriving after the fact to inspect them. That is the whole art of it laid bare. The next day the convoy moved on to White River. The foundry there ran twice the scale of Okivan. It left the same impression twice as deep. Crawford walked the floor a second time. By my informant's account, he stopped asking questions somewhere around the 3rd furnace. The heat off that furnace alone would have been enough to quiet a lesser craftsman's doubts. After that he started simply nodding. There is a particular kind of silence an expert falls into when he stops looking for the flaw and starts admiring the work instead. Crawford fell into it completely. I suspect he left White River more impressed with the craftsmanship than troubled by any lingering doubt about its origins. An old man's pride in good steel can do more of my work than any bribe. Pride asks fewer questions than suspicion ever does. 3 days after that, the news reached Golden Lion in the capital. His face went dark before the messenger finished the second sentence. The Business Alliance's leadership had ruled, formally and in writing, that the origins of Golden Eagle's new products were legitimate. No merchant could interfere with their sale inside the capital market going forward. No noble could either. No band going forward could interfere with their sale inside the capital market. Golden Lion had spent a fortune and a season trying to strangle a trade route. A whole season, gone toward a conclusion that undid itself in a week. The ruling closed every door he had spent that fortune opening. I read the final report from Greywood with a cup of tea I did not bother finishing. Satisfaction rarely needs a second cup to sustain it. Steam curled off the surface long after I had stopped paying attention to it. The scent of it lingered anyway, faint and bitter, the kind of smell I associate with reports that end well. Every brick at Oakhaven had been priced, built, and placed months before Golden Lion knew there was a game being played. Every ledger at White River carried the same weight of preparation behind it. Every silver coin routed through the church had traveled that same quiet distance ahead of him. He fought the visible half of my operation and lost. He never once suspected there was an invisible half holding the whole structure up. Most men never look for the half of the board they cannot see, which is precisely why it stays hidden from them. That is the only kind of advantage worth keeping. I intend to keep it that way for as long as the game runs. The tea had gone cold by the time I set the cup down. I did not mind. Cold tea and a clean report make for a fair trade. That is, in the end, the only kind of victory worth financing, the kind your opponent cannot even locate well enough to properly resent. Serena and I sit across the desk from each other. The office is quiet except for the scratch of a clerk's pen somewhere past the door. I let my eyes rest on her face before either of us speaks. Dust motes hang in the light falling through the window, slow and undisturbed. I watch them drift and think how strange it is that a room can hold this much stillness now. 2 years ago I would not have trusted this much quiet in a room with her in it. It has been close to 2 years since we sat like this, just the two of us. No ledger of my debts between us this time. No column of numbers waiting to condemn me. I keep waiting for the old weight to settle on my chest anyway, and it does not come. The last time she visited me in the mansion, she came to catalog my losses at the card tables. Her mouth was a flat line of disappointment then, and she never bothered to hide it. She wore that disappointment the way other people wear a coat, comfortable in it, certain of it. I remember how small that made me, sitting under her eyes while she counted what I had thrown away. The memory has a taste to it even now, something bitter I have learned to swallow without flinching. Some part of that memory still sits in my chest, dull now instead of sharp. Now she looks travel-worn instead. Dust still sits in the seams of her coat, ground into the fabric from the road north. Her boots carry the same dust, cracked at the toe from however many miles brought her here. I catalogue the wear on her the way she used to catalogue mine, out of old habit more than judgment. There is no ledger in her hands this time. Only a question, forming behind her eyes before she has decided how to ask it. I can see her deciding where to start, the way she used to decide which account to open first. She starts with Oakhaven and White River. She lays the pieces out the way she would price a shipment. Careful. Methodical. Testing the weight of each one before she sets it down. Her hands move over the imaginary ledger like she still keeps one somewhere behind her ribs. She says it plainly. I built those factories early enough to hand Duke Ace's business alliance investigators a paper trail that would hold up to scrutiny. I tell her that is true. But it is not the reason. It is only a convenient second use for something I would have built anyway. The real reason sits in the ground itself, I explain. Oakhaven's ore veins and White River's limestone are deposits Greywood's own soil does not have. I watch her weigh that, the way she used to weigh a stranger's promise before deciding whether to extend credit. Her eyes narrow the way they always did when a number did not match the story attached to it. And beyond the ore, I tell her, there is a simpler principle. One production center is one point of failure. I do not build my income around a single fire or a single siege. Spreading capacity across 3 sites means no single disaster erases what I have spent 2 years assembling. She sits with that. The clerk's pen scratches on somewhere past the door, indifferent to what is being decided in here. I watch her recalculate, the way a merchant recalculates a price when the first number was wrong. Her fingers still against the edge of the desk while she works through it. I can almost see the old ledgers behind her eyes, columns shifting to make room for a version of me she has not accounted for yet. For a moment I wonder how many versions of me she has buried already to get here. Then she asks me outright how many soldiers I actually command. No preamble this time, no softening the question with something smaller first. Her voice carries the same directness I remember from years of watching her negotiate prices nobody else dared quote. I give her the number without dressing it up. Greywood's population has passed 70,000. The Iron Guard now stands at 7,000. 1,500 of them are still drilling. I watch the number land on her, the way a coin lands and settles before anyone decides if it is real. She does not accept it at face value. I respect that she does not. A woman who built her reputation on knowing when a number is lying to her does not stop asking questions just because the answer sounds tidy. She has seen the orc laborers with her own eyes. The width of their shoulders. The ease with which they move stone that would take 5 men to shift. I imagine her watching them from a cart window on the road in, doing the same silent arithmetic she is doing now. Surely, she says, the real number is higher than 7,000. I tell her the orcs are laborers, not soldiers. Not yet. And the distinction matters more than she thinks. She is not satisfied. She asks the sharper question. What is the true number if the crisis were real? I answer her question with one of my own. If someone came to burn down the only home standing between her and ruin, would she not bite back with everything she had? She goes quiet. Her hands rest still on her lap, the restlessness gone out of them for the first time since she sat down. I can see she does not need the arithmetic spelled out any further. Every soul in Greywood owes their meal, their roof, and their wages to this territory holding. That debt does not sit passive in a ledger. It walks and it fights. She has never seen that in the capital. There, the crowds move through their days like men already half-buried. Surviving rather than living. Going through motions that stopped meaning anything long ago. I remember that crowd myself, the shuffle of it, the way nobody looked at anybody else long enough to be seen. I remember hating how easily I once fit into that same shuffle. I tell her not to lose sleep over Golden Lion sending a real army north. The numbers do not favor it. The orc war on the southern front is eating the Empire's real strength. Nothing is spare for a northern campaign against one disgraced, stripped nobleman. At most, I tell her, Golden Lion scrapes together a few thousand men from northern lords nursing old grudges. My 7,000 handle that without strain. She studies my face for a long moment. She is searching for the crack that used to be easy to find, the tell that always gave me away across a card table or a negotiation. I let her look, unbothered, and wait for her to finish whatever count she is running behind her eyes. The old me would have looked away by now, and we both know it. She does not find one. It visibly unsettles her, a small shift in how she holds her shoulders. She asks, half a joke and half not, what magic pill I swallowed. Or which god decided to climb into my skin and change me this much in under 2 years. I let the question hang without an answer. The truth is not one I can hand her. A mind carried out of time. A system that pays me silver for every soul I keep fed. Ideas nobody in this world has any name for. None of that translates into anything she could use, or even believe. I turn the thought over anyway, wondering what she would do with even a fragment of it if I handed it to her plainly. She would price it before she believed it, I think, the way she prices everything. Instead, I let her think it is discipline or luck or both. Either answer is cheap enough to give away. She does not push further. What she does next surprises me more than her question did. She tells me, without my prompting, that she has noticed something about Greywood's silence. Every spy Golden Lion sent north to learn what is happening here has stopped reporting back. She says it evenly, watching for my reaction rather than offering one of her own. She does not flinch from what that means. I have been removing anyone who might carry our secrets south. The words sit flat between us, and I let them sit there without softening them. If anything, she looks at me with something closer to respect than fear. The way one merchant admires another's ruthlessness in closing a deal. Recognizing the same instinct in someone else that she trusts in herself. It is a strange thing, being looked at that way by the same woman who once tallied my failures without blinking. Then she lays her real purpose on the desk between us. She wants to rebuild Nightingale starting now. She wants to push south immediately to open trade with the southern kingdoms. Give her capital and manpower, she says, and she will have the Chamber of Commerce standing again within 2 months. I tell her no. Not yet. I explain that the Cathedral of Holy Light is already carrying Greywood's name north through Bishop Macbeth's church network. Word is passing hand to hand, through people who trust the cloth more than any merchant's promise. That kind of reputation needs time to travel south properly. It needs to move through the same channels before our caravans arrive under it. Arrive too early, I tell her, and we are just another unknown northern outfit with a story too convenient to trust. Arrive at the right time, and we are the territory that built the cathedral. A name that opens doors before we have said a word. Legitimacy bought with patience is worth more than legitimacy bought with haste, I tell her. She has no counter for that. I can see her own instincts agreeing before her pride catches up to them. She knows better than most that in a market like the South's, the word legitimate carries more weight than the quality of the goods themselves. I watch the old version of her argue with the new information and lose. It is a quiet argument, fought entirely behind her eyes, and it does not take long. I tell her to rest. Spend her first weeks learning Greywood as it actually is, not as she imagines it from the capital's habits. The Southern question will still be there when the timing is right. I will bring it to her myself. She agrees, reluctant. But she agrees, and I count that as a good sign. She rises to leave. Satisfied, I think, that she has finished rebuilding her picture of me. I stop her before she reaches the door. I take a small wooden box from the desk drawer. Its finish is smoother than anything else in this office, polished by hands more careful than mine. I set it down between us with more care than the moment probably requires. Inside sits a brass nautical compass, small enough to close in one hand. She has seen ship's compasses before. Bulky things that swing wide and useless in any real wind. More decoration than instrument once the waves pick up. This one holds steady the moment I set it on the desk. Its needle finds true north and stays there without a tremor. I explain the magnets inside have been treated by a process that makes the needle 10 times more sensitive than anything currently sold on any dock in the empire. And 10 times more stable besides. Small enough, I tell her, to mount right beside a ship's helm without crowding the wheel. The first batch is under 100 units, I explain. Not enough to flood a market. Only enough to test one. Once the cathedral's name has traveled far enough south, this compass rides the first wave of goods through Nightingale's reopened routes. She stares at it the way I imagine a starving man stares at bread. Her fingers hover near the brass casing before she lets herself touch it. She does not need me to explain the value to her. Any Southern captain would trade a season's profit for shorter routes and fewer wrecks. She asks if it can be taken apart and copied. I tell her the magnet treatment process lives in the hands of 3 people in all of Greywood and nowhere else. Anyone who cracks the casing open finds an ordinary trinket. Nothing more. The real value stays locked in a process they will never see. She sits with that, turning the compass over once in her fingers before setting it down. The light catches the brass for a second, then she lets it rest on the desk between us. She tells me, without the edge she usually carries in her voice, that she spent years in the capital's business circles. She never met anyone who could produce one disruptive good after another while waiting, patient, for the exact right moment to release each one. She admits plainly that she underestimated me. The words cost her something to say, and I hear it in the way she says them. I do not press her to say more than that. For a breath neither of us adds anything to that, and the quiet between us feels different from the quiet at the start of this meeting. Even the dust in the window light seems to have settled, the room finally still around whatever has just changed in it. Outside the clerk's pen has gone quiet too, and I wonder briefly what he is waiting to hear. I stand and offer her my hand, welcoming her properly to Greywood. Not as a debt-ridden brother she once tolerated, but as whatever I am now. She takes it. I watch something shift in her expression as she does. It is a different hand than the one she remembers grasping at coin across a mansion table. Steadier now. Warmer than she expected. Her grip answers mine before her expression catches up to it, like her body has already decided something her mind is still weighing. She holds it a second longer than a handshake requires, and then she lets go and walks out to see the territory she's decided to trust. After Serena walked out, I stood at the window a while longer. The room behind me held onto her absence the way rooms do, a little colder for it. The glass held the last color of the sky, a thin gray-orange fading into true dark. I watched the color drain out of it degree by degree. The evening cold seeped through the glass and settled against my knuckles. I pressed my palm flat against the pane and let the chill climb up through my wrist. It moved slower than I expected, patient as everything else that night. I let it do the one thing cold air does better than anything else in the world. It cleared the noise out of my head. Every ambition, every unfinished letter, every account still open in my mind, quiet for a few breaths. That quiet was worth more to me than most conversations I have in a given week. Somewhere below, a servant's lantern crossed the courtyard and vanished behind a wall. I watched the small light go and thought of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of relief. For a few seconds I allowed myself that emptiness, since a mind that never rests eventually starts making mistakes. I have watched sharper men than me lose an argument to their own exhaustion. One rule I never break, not once, not for convenience: never underestimate an enemy holding a weapon, no matter how pitiful they look on a ledger. I have watched too many capable men die from forgetting that exact rule. Numbers on paper are patient things. They wait the way a debt waits, without complaint, without hurry. They sit quiet in a column, harmless, until someone with nothing left to lose decides the arithmetic doesn't matter anymore. Desperation has its own logic, and it doesn't consult anyone's ledger before acting. Then those weak numbers turn into corpses on the ground, and the ledger stops mattering to anyone. I called Sylvie in. She came without a word, already carrying the rolled map of the North under one arm. Her steps were quiet on the stone floor, the kind of quiet that comes from long practice rather than caution. I have never once heard her stumble on those stairs, even in the dark. We spread it across the table between us, weighting the corners with whatever was in reach. An inkpot on one corner, a paperweight on another, a stray dagger on the third. The candlelight caught the dagger's edge and threw a thin line of brightness across the parchment. It flickered once when a draft crossed the room, then settled again. Our core holdings sat colored in solid ink, the old red leaf lands, Oakhaven, White River. A settled rear area, quiet and profitable, the kind of ground that generates silver instead of demanding it. I let my eyes rest there a moment on the solid color, before moving to the edges. At the edges of the map, 7 smaller territories sat unclaimed. Gray, unmarked, like scraps nobody had bothered to color in yet. 2 of them belonged to men who carried titles. Viscount Winter held one, Viscount Yellowfur the other. Neither name carried any particular weight in my mind, only a location and a set of numbers. The remaining 5 belonged to barons too minor to matter as individuals, the kind of names that blur together in a report. I doubt I could have named all 5 without checking the page twice. Combined population across all 7, roughly 130,000. Combined standing forces, a number almost insulting to say out loud in the same room as a war map. 2,300 men, poorly equipped, poorly trained, the sort of force that exists on paper more than in any field. I tapped the edge of the map once, thinking of how easily that number could mislead someone less careful. A number that small has a way of making a commander careless right before it makes him dead. Sylvie studied the map, then studied me. Her expression stayed unreadable, the way it always does when she's waiting for me to explain a decision before she questions it. She asked the obvious question, why we hadn't already rolled the Iron Guard over all 7 and called it finished. I told her the number on the map was not the number that mattered. 2,300 is what those lords keep fed and armed on an ordinary day. An ordinary day, I reminded her, was not the day I was planning for. It is not what they can put in front of a wall when the alternative is annihilation. Hand a pitchfork to every serf who can hold one. Buy every mercenary blade within 3 days' ride. Even a baron with nothing else going for him can scrape together 5,000 or 6,000 bodies in a siege, once desperation does the recruiting for him. Fear turns farmers into soldiers faster than any drill sergeant ever could. The Iron Guard would still win that fight. Our artillery and our steel crossbows make certain of that outcome before the first formation even moves. I have seen what those crossbows do a shield wall, and it isn't a contest worth dignifying with the word battle. But winning was never the question I was asking myself in that room. The real question was how many of my own men I would bury to prove a point that never needed proving in the first place. Every soldier in that army represents years of training behind him. Years of feeding, years of equipping, a long accumulation of cost that doesn't show up as a single number. I think of each one as a small standing debt that only grows more valuable the longer he stays alive. Each one carries a fixed daily return in silver, and that return stops the instant he's dead. Spending soldiers to grind down men who were already beaten before the first arrow flew isn't strategy. It's waste, dressed up in the language of glory so it looks better on parade. I have no interest in glory that shows up as a loss on my books. So I told Sylvie to bring me the files on economic warfare instead. If I could break these 7 territories without spending a single life, that was the only acceptable price to pay. Anything more expensive than that wasn't a victory worth calling a victory. Sylvie nodded once and rolled the map back up without another question. She has stopped asking me to explain the arithmetic twice. She came back the next day with a dossier thick enough to double as a doorstop. I weighed it in my hand before opening it, half expecting padding. There was none. The paper smelled of fresh ink and the faint mildew of a courier's saddlebag. Months of quiet work were already sitting inside it, further along than I expected when I'd given the order. Greywood had been dumping cheap, refined salt into all 7 territories. Cheap textiles followed the salt, then cheap steel farm tools, all priced below anything a local producer could match. Local smiths and weavers had no answer for prices that low, and I doubt they ever will. The most effective weapon in the whole campaign turned out to be liquor. Cheap, high-proof grain spirits, sold for less than local taverns paid just to distill their own stock. There's a certain irony in conquering territory with cheap drink instead of steel, and I let myself enjoy it for a moment. In Viscount Winter's territory, every tavern that once competed with us had already closed its doors. Even his own soldiers were buying black market Greywood spirits under the table. Loyalty has never once outbid a good price, and I've never seen a reason to expect it might start. A few of the lords tried banning our goods outright. Those bans collapsed almost as fast as they were announced, faster than the ink dried on the proclamations. One quartermaster got caught hoarding banned kerosene for resale. He was turned in by the one guard on his staff who hadn't been cut in on the scheme, and the irony of that wasn't lost on me. Corruption tends to eat itself eventually, given enough time and enough greed. Nothing kills a ban faster than the enforcers profiting more from breaking it than from keeping it. Alongside the goods, we had been posting mercenary contracts too generous to refuse. Escorting ore carts, clearing mountain roads, work with real pay and almost no risk of dying. Every free company and hired blade within reach signed with us instead of the 7 territories. That left those lords holding nothing but untrained serfs armed with borrowed spears. An army that can't hire is an army that can't fight, no matter what its treasury still claims on paper. Sylvie's report didn't stop at trade and contracts, though. I turned the next page slower, sensing it would matter more than the numbers before it. A city defense commander in one of the baronies had been bribed already. He was ready to conveniently fall ill whenever the timing called for it. 2 knight commanders who refused every offer we made had died in a staged accident. It was tidy enough to leave no one asking further questions, which is the entire point of staging 1. An adjutant buried in gambling debt was now compromised, cooperative, and reporting everything worth reporting back to us. Debt does more recruiting for me than any recruiter I've ever hired outright. The lords of all 7 territories were not sleeping well anymore, according to Sylvie's sources. Food got tasted before it reached their tables. Guards got doubled at every door in every hall. And still none of them could point to where the danger was actually coming from. That was the entire design from the start, an enemy they could feel closing in but never locate, let alone fight back against. I told Sylvie to let them stew a while longer before we moved in to formalize what was already decided in every way that mattered. Fear is free. It does half the work that soldiers would otherwise have to do at cost, and it never sends a bill. I closed the dossier and set it aside, already thinking of the next report waiting behind it. The room had gone fully dark by then, and I hadn't bothered to call for a lamp. There was a certain comfort in that darkness, the kind that asks nothing of me. While all of that unfolded quietly in the north, something else was collapsing in the capital. I only learned the details afterward, through channels that cost me more silver than I like to admit out loud. Some information is worth the price no matter how steep the courier's fee turns out to be. What used to be the Grand Bohemia ducal mansion still stood, technically. Ruin is a generous word for what was left of it in practice. Guards ringed the property day and night. Not to protect the man inside, but to make certain he never left it under any circumstance. My father, Duke Richard Bohemia, spent his afternoons in the estate's greenhouse. He pruned flowers that were dying anyway, a habit that struck me as fitting once I heard about it secondhand. A man tending to things already past saving, hour after hour, day after day. I picture the glass walls of that greenhouse clouded with old condensation, nobody left to wipe them clean. I imagine the smell of wet soil and rot clinging to a man who once commanded armies. There is no dignity left in that image, and I doubt he was looking for any. 2 years earlier he had backed the losing side of a coup soaked in enough blood to end an empire twice over. He lost, and losing that particular gamble cost him everything that once made him untouchable. The new Emperor Reynolds chose not to execute him for it. Execution ends suffering, and Reynolds has never had any interest in ending anything quickly. House arrest let him watch a family's slow collapse unfold in real time. That does more damage to a man like my father than any blade ever could have managed in a single stroke. For 2 years the one thread he held onto was Arthur's southern campaign. Proof, he hoped, that the Bohemia name still meant something to anyone beyond that estate's walls. An old servant came stumbling into the greenhouse one afternoon with news that Arthur had returned. Not in triumph, though. Arrested for treason instead, thrown into a dungeon cell next to the mother who bore him. My father collapsed on the spot. A stroke took what little strength 2 years of house arrest hadn't already stripped from him. He coughed blood onto the same withered flowers he had been pruning only a moment before. Whatever reserve of will had kept him upright broke the instant his son's freedom did. I heard all this secondhand, weeks later, filtered through paid ears and careful letters. I read the account twice, looking for some feeling in myself that never quite arrived in full. I still haven't decided what to do with the feeling it left behind in me. This is a man who exiled his own son to the north with nothing but a name and an expectation of failure. He never once sent word, never sent coin, never sent help, while I built something out of that nothing he handed me. I owe him no grief, and I've told myself that plainly more than once. And yet grief showed up anyway, uninvited, the way old debts sometimes do regardless of whether you meant to collect on them. It arrived quiet, without ceremony, and left just as quietly once I'd acknowledged it. I set the paper down for a moment and rubbed at my eyes before continuing. The candle by then had burned down to a stub, and I let it burn out on its own. Reynolds, from what I've since pieced together, took the news of our family's collapse with the same interest he'd give a weather report. Arthur and Stephanie imprisoned, Richard reduced to a man who couldn't finish a sentence. That was exactly the outcome he had engineered from the start, down to the last detail. He has always preferred a slow public disintegration over a clean execution. Destroying morale is worth more to him than destroying bodies ever could be. But the report that actually held his attention that day wasn't about us at all. It concerned Duke Golden Lion instead, whose campaign against Golden Eagle's new products had gotten louder by the week. More public, more aggressive, more than Reynolds found comfortable watching from the throne. Reynolds has no sympathy for the Bohemias, and he needed none to act the way he did. His real concern was a different one entirely, sitting underneath the surface of the report. Golden Lion was growing strong enough to threaten the very balance Reynolds depends on to keep any single house from becoming unchallengeable. An intelligence officer laid 3 more pieces of northern news on his desk that same day. Duke Ace's business alliance tour had thoroughly discredited Golden Lion's attempt at a sales ban. It made him look small in front of merchants who mattered more than his pride did. The church had quietly signaled its support for a cathedral project underway in Greywood. And the mastermind behind both of those developments was, by every account, reaching the capital myself. A stripped noble, technically a rebel, refusing to surrender land I no longer had any legal claim to. Reynolds did not react with anger when he read my name on that report. He reacted, from what the officer later described, with something closer to recognition. An overlooked younger brother, quietly outmaneuvering everyone while the family's golden child burned himself down in public. He had lived that story once himself, as the underestimated third son nobody expected to end up on the throne. He rose the same way I'm rising now, and I doubt that similarity was lost on him for even a second of that meeting. There's a strange comfort in being read so clearly by a man I have never once stood in front of. It is not the same as being understood, and I know better than to mistake the two. The next morning, Arthur's sentencing took place in a smaller side hall of the Senate. Away from public crowds, with only a handful of ministers present to witness it. Golden Lion was among them, and he pushed hard for a public hanging. A spectacle built to cement his own dominance in front of the assembled court. Reynolds chose differently and far more quietly than Golden Lion wanted. Arthur was stripped of every title and every holding he still nominally carried. He was sentenced to lifelong hard labor in the Western Obsidian mines. A slow death with no stage and no audience to turn into a martyr's exit for the Bohemia name. Stephanie was sent to a convent, drugged into silence for the remainder of her life. No spectacle, no execution, no story anyone could later tell about Bohemia defiance. Just quiet erasure, framed as imperial justice rather than what it actually was, a political purge dressed in formal language. It also happened to slap down Golden Lion's overreach without Reynolds ever needing to raise his voice about it. Golden Lion pressed further anyway, raising the matter of my continued defiance in the North. He expected an easy win on that point, given everything else in the room. Reynolds cut him off instead with a pointed reminder about Golden Lion's own recent turbulence in the capital's markets. Then he ruled on the matter himself, without inviting further debate. Since I was funding the church's cathedral as a supposed act of Bohemia redemption, the Senate had no business interfering in church affairs. And since the empire's real military strength remained committed to the southern front, a remote northern backwater wasn't worth the cost of subduing. Neither reason had anything to do with mercy toward me, and I'd never once expect that it did. What it amounted to was unofficial protection, granted for exactly one reason. Keeping me alive and defiant kept a permanent thorn lodged in Golden Lion's side, right where Reynolds wanted it. A useful pawn left in play is worth more to an emperor like Reynolds than a dead troublemaker ever could be. I understand that calculation because it's the same one I make about my own enemies, on a smaller scale. Golden Lion stood there as Reynolds walked off. He understood precisely how he had just been used and blocked in the same breath, and there was nothing left for him to say about it. And somewhere in that hall, without ever meeting me, without ever intending to help me, the emperor of the empire that exiled me had just bought me more time than my own father ever managed to. I set the letter down on my desk once I'd finished reading through the account, and I looked out at the dark settling over the north. The lamp on my desk had burned low, and the wick hissed once before steadying. A thin curl of smoke rose from it and dissolved before it reached the ceiling. Beyond the window, the north lay quiet under a sky gone fully black, patient in a way that had nothing to do with mercy. I stood there a while longer, letting the cold from the glass find my hand again. Somewhere out there Sylvie's dossier was already becoming policy, and 7 gray patches on a map were already turning color without a single sword drawn. No father's blessing bought me the north, and no father's collapse will take it back. I'll take an enemy's convenience over a father's sentiment any day, at least the enemy's math is honest. The Iron Guard did not storm Viscount Yellowfear's castle. We camped instead a few hundred meters from the wall. Close enough that every man on those battlements could count our cook fires. We roasted whole sheep on iron spits within clear sight of the battlements. I had the cooks rub the meat down with pepper and clove oil. The smell carried on the wind straight up to the defenders above. It drifted over the moat and up the stone in slow, deliberate waves, as if the wind itself had taken my side. I watched the smoke curl and thought it looked almost polite, the way it drifted, like it knew exactly whose side it was meant to be on. No siege engine I own works half as fast as a hungry man's imagination. Payroll went out in full view of the wall too. Silver counted into gloved hands, coin by coin, in the open. The clink of it traveled farther than any of us expected, sharp and metallic against the quiet of a starving siege. Soldiers laughed while it happened. Someone sang off-key by the second fire, badly enough that others started placing bets on when he'd stop. He lost every bet by singing 3 more verses out of pure spite. I let the bets stand and didn't collect a coin of my own on any of them, which surprised exactly nobody who knows how I spend an evening. On the ramparts above, Yellowfear's defenders stood wrapped in whatever cloth they had left against the cold. They watched men eat like kings a stone's throw from their own empty stomachs. I doubt any of them tasted clove oil in months, and I wanted them thinking about that. I sat on a camp stool with a cup of tea going lukewarm in my hand. Steam still lifted off it in thin curls, though the warmth was mostly gone by the time I noticed. I watched Rain pace in front of me back and forth, boots cutting the same track in the dirt. The track was deep enough by then that I could have measured his patience in inches of packed earth. Reen wanted the order to advance. He was convinced we could carry the gate inside an hour with steel shields and crossbow volleys alone. He was probably right about the hour. He was wrong about the math. Speed is cheap when you're not the one paying the bill in bodies. I told him the question was never whether we would win. The question was how many of my soldiers I would spend winning it. Every man in Iron Guard armor cost me years of training. He cost me years of feeding, drilling, and equipping besides. I was not converting that investment into corpses for a city that was already dying on its own. Reen didn't understand hunger as a weapon. Not the way I did, not yet. He'd grow into it, given time and one or two more sieges like this one. I explained it to him anyway, watching steam curl off my cup into the cold air. Those men on the wall hadn't eaten a reel in days. They hadn't been paid in months either. They had just watched their enemy do both wages and roast mutton, without lifting a single crossbow in answer. Resentment does more damage than any battering ram. It doesn't cost me a single soldier to swing it. I told Reen the gate would open itself before morning. Not because I was clairvoyant. Because starving, unpaid men have a talent for turning on the Lord who starved and unpaid them. Reen didn't like waiting. I didn't care. Waiting was free, and free was my favorite price. I finished the last of my tea while he kept pacing, and by the time the cup was empty his boots had worn the track a little deeper still. Somewhere past the second watch he stopped pacing and just stood there, staring at the gate like it owed him money. Inside those walls, Viscount Huangshan was already past managing his men. He had moved into the harder business of simply surviving them. His treasury had been bled dry months earlier. The same economic strangulation had already gutted 6 other northern holdouts before him. Cheap goods flooding his markets, poached mercenaries, bribed stewards, sabotaged supply trains, one after another. Now there was nothing left to pay a garrison that could smell fresh mutton from the wall. His officers wouldn't meet his eyes anymore when he gave an order. Some of his own men had started sharpening knives. Their reasons had nothing to do with the siege outside the gate. A starving army turns its blades inward before it ever turns them outward. Days earlier, Huangshan had hired a mercenary captain to stiffen his defense. A scarred, quiet man who called himself Eagle Owl. Nobody in that castle knew the captain was a 4th-tier killer. He had been planted by Duke Golden Lion for exactly one purpose. That purpose was my death. Eagle Owl had spent those days doing nothing more than watching. He was patient the way a bought knife is patient, waiting for the lock to turn just right. He found his opening in Huangshan's despair. He pointed out how relaxed the Iron Guard camp looked from the wall. No trenches, no palisade, nothing dug in. My own tent sat near the back with a guard detail that looked almost decorative. That was by design, though he had no way of knowing it. One furious charge, he said, aimed straight at the command tent. It could kill or capture the man running this whole campaign. It could break the Iron Guard's spine before a single formation could answer. He didn't mention that breaking my spine was the only payment he actually cared about collecting. Huangshan had 2 options left in his own mind. Die by his own soldiers' hands within the week. Or die charging the enemy like a lord instead of a hostage. He chose the version with better paperwork for his family name. He gave the order. The gates of his own castle groaned open. Word spread through his ranks faster than any trumpet could have carried it. Break the Iron Guard line, and the meat and the silver in that camp belonged to whoever got there first. Nearly 1,000 starving men poured out of the gate in a ragged, roaring wave. It was less an army than a crowd that had decided hunger was worth dying over. I watched the charge form from the flap of my tent, tea still in hand. I genuinely could not believe what I was looking at. Huangshan was throwing broken, half-fed serfs at 7,000 men with steel crossbows and cannon. The theory, apparently, was that desperation counts as a battle plan. Desperation has never once counted as a battle plan, not in this world or the one I came from. Some officers in my position would have grabbed a blade and ridden out to meet the charge personally. All banners and drama, proving their courage to a crowd of onlookers who'd tell the story for years. I have never understood why any commander thinks his own skull is an acceptable stake in a bet he doesn't need to place. My life outprices any legend I could buy by standing in a front line I don't need to stand in. So I didn't move toward the fight. I moved away from it, calmly at a walk. I gave Rain the order to bring up the shield wall. Rank the crossbows, roll the cannon forward. Then I withdrew behind 2 full layers of guards to the quietest corner of camp I had. I know how that looks to men raised on stories of lords who lead every charge from the front. It looks like cowardice. It is bookkeeping, and I have never once been embarrassed by good bookkeeping. The shield wall did exactly what I built it to do. Steel tower shields locked together, rank against rank. Crossbow bolts came down in disciplined volleys, one after another without pause. The rhythm of it was almost mechanical: load, level, release, load again. The cannon opened lanes through the charging mass. Smoke rolled low across the field, thick enough to blur the line between the living and the dying. The first wave turned into a smoking argument against attacking prepared infantry with your bare hands. Men who had been running toward silver and roast mutton found themselves running into a wall of iron. The iron did not care how hungry they were. The slaughter was fast, one-sided, and almost boring to watch from where I stood. That is precisely how I like my battles. Boring means nobody I train gets buried this week. But somewhere inside that dying charge, one man was not dying at all. Eagle Owl had folded himself into the fleeing, screaming crowd. He let the chaos hide him the way a drop of ink hides in a flood. He was suppressing every trace of his own power, aura, presence, the faint wrongness that marks a fourth-tier body. He read as just another starving soldier about to die for nothing. He found an Iron Guard soldier isolated in the press near the shield line. He killed him without a sound worth noticing in all that noise. Then he did something no soldier on either side would have believed possible. He reshaped his own bones. Jaw, brow, the set of his shoulders, the length of his limbs, all of it shifted under his skin. It moved like wax held too close to a flame. It remolded itself against the dead man's face and build. He peeled the corpse's armor off. He put it on over skin still warm from a body that was no longer his own. Then he turned around. He started walking backward through my own ranks, one more Iron Guard soldier falling back from the line. He worked his way toward the one tent that mattered. The disguise held longer than it should have. He passed one checkpoint by claiming a snapped spear shaft and orders to fall back for a fresh weapon. The soldier there, rattled by the fighting, waved him through without much thought. It nearly worked twice. The second checkpoint belonged to one of Sylvie's internal affairs officers. It was the quiet corpse she'd built specifically to make sure nobody impersonated their way into places they didn't belong. The officer asked for the day's verbal password. I had written that password myself. It was a string of nonsense syllables borrowed from half-remembered radio chatter out of a life nobody in this world could imagine. It had no grammar and no meaning in any language spoken on this continent. Eagle Owl had spent a career cracking real ciphers. He had bluffed real guards and slipped past real security built by people who understood secrecy. None of that training had prepared him for a password engineered to be gibberish even to me on a bad morning. He hesitated a half-second too long. He improvised an answer that sounded almost right and was completely wrong. The officer's face changed before Eagle Owl finished the sentence. The officer called him out as an infiltrator in the same breath he reached for his sword. Eagle Owl didn't wait to be arrested. He crushed the officer's throat with one hand. He was already moving before the body hit the ground. Soldiers grabbed for him as he passed. They came away with dislocated wrists and shattered ribs for the trouble. His speed was no longer something a first or second-tier body could answer. He covered the last stretch toward my position at a dead sprint that no human frame should have been capable of. I heard the screaming shift direction before I understood what it meant. The pitch changed first, panic instead of pain, moving toward me instead of away. That shift in pitch is a sound I will recognize for the rest of my life. Eagle Owl came through the last line of shields like water finding a gap. His spine bent at angles that made the soldiers around him flinch back out of pure instinct. A spear thrust that should have opened his chest passed through empty air. His ribs had already folded out of its path before the point arrived. He killed the man who threw it on his way past. He killed the man beside him too and didn't slow down for either. Sylvie wasn't there. She was deployed elsewhere on my orders. The guards left around my position were first and second tier men. They were competent against soldiers, meaningless against what was now running straight at me. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it wasn't dignified and I don't particularly care. I did not draw a sword. I reached into the lining of my coat. I had spent months quietly sewing in tools nobody in this world had a name for yet. 2 glass vials left my hand. They shattered against Eagle Owl's face, spraying concentrated chili extract straight into his eyes. He staggered, screaming. His hands clawed at a burn that had nothing to do with any wound he understood. I followed it with a smoke canister that hissed open at his feet. Thick gray vapor swallowed him whole. It stung and blinded him on top of the chemical fire already in his eyes. What he couldn't see was the ground. I had ordered the earth in front of my position slicked with industrial lubricant hours earlier. It sat invisible under the dust, meant for exactly this kind of charge. Preparation is just cowardice with better planning, and I'll take that trade every time. His next stride went out from under him entirely. His leg shot sideways while the rest of him kept trying to move forward. He hit the ground hard, half-blind, humiliated. He was furious in a way that made the air around him feel dangerous even before he moved again. From flat on his back, he fired a hidden dart at my chest. It was some final poisoned reflex of a professional killer refusing to die without one more attempt. It struck me square in the sternum and skittered off. The mithril chainmail I keep sewn under every coat I own in public turned it aside. He didn't have time to process the failure. He forced himself back upright on raw power alone. Muscles and reshaped bone dragged him up through pain that would have ended a lesser fighter. He closed the last step between us. He raised his hand for what would have been the final strike. His boots didn't move. The ground there had also been treated. A fast-setting industrial adhesive had been laid down that morning under a thin scatter of dirt. His own weight had driven his soles straight into it. He was stuck, blind, burning, and one step from me for perhaps 2 full seconds. 2 seconds was enough. I drew the pistol from my coat. It was the crude, hand-forged, hand-cranked thing I'd built myself. Nobody else on this continent had the first idea such a weapon could exist. I pressed the barrel to his forehead. The metal was warm from being pressed against my ribs all morning, an oddly domestic detail to notice in that instant. I pulled the trigger. The sound that came out of that pistol was unlike anything any soldier on that field had ever heard in their lives. It was a crack louder than thunder and twice as close. Eagle Owl's head came apart in front of me. Whatever he had been, killer, tool, legend, ended between one heartbeat and the next. His body dropped where the adhesive still held his boots. For a moment the only sound near me was smoke hissing off the ground. My own ears rang under it, a high thin note that took a long while to fade. My hand stayed steady around the grip until the sound was gone, and only then did I let myself look down at what was left of him. Rain reached me seconds later. The look on his face told me he understood exactly how close that had come. He dropped to one knee in the dirt without being asked. Around him a dozen soldiers followed, heads bowed. They begged forgiveness for a security failure that had nearly cost me everything. I told them, flatly, that no security detail in any kingdom stops a 4th-tier infiltrator who wants you dead badly enough. Not even a full royal guard. There was no fault to assign, I said, and I meant every word of it out loud. What I didn't say out loud was how badly my hand had been shaking around that pistol grip. Cold sweat had soaked through the glove before I'd even pulled the trigger. The calm on my face was manufactured for an audience. It was built the same way everything else about me is built, deliberately, for effect. Underneath it I was still doing the math on how close 2 seconds of glue had come to being the difference between my empire and my funeral. 3rd tier and 4th tier are not 2 rungs on the same ladder. They are 2 different sports. Greywood had exactly 1 player capable of competing in the second one, and that player was Sylvie. 1 assassin, alone, unsupported, had walked through my entire camp. He had reached arm's length of my chest doing it. That is not a gap I intend to keep losing sleep over while hoping nobody else notices it. I decided then, standing over a headless corpse glued to my own dirt, that firearms stopped being a curiosity. They start being policy, whatever it costs to build them at scale. Cultivation takes decades and monsters like Eagle Owl to produce. A pistol takes a forge, a cartridge, and a trigger finger. I would rather outproduce the world's monsters than wait years hoping to outgrow them. That arithmetic isn't cruelty, whatever the old nobility wants to call it. The numbers came in before dusk. Of Yellowfear's roughly 1,000 attackers, the shield wall and crossbows had cost the Iron Guard 3 casualties in total. It was a lopsided victory by any measure worth writing down. The single assassin working alone, however, had killed 5 of my soldiers before I put a bullet through his skull. 5 names I would be paying pensions on for families that no longer had a father in them. I made myself picture each name against a face before letting the ledger close on it. Clean victories don't feel clean when the ledger has names attached to the losses. I let myself feel that one before I filed it away. Then I moved on to the next problem, because the next problem was already being dragged toward me in chains. Viscount Huangshan was caught trying to flee through a drainage tunnel. He was hauled in front of me covered in mud and his own dried sweat. He straightened his spine as best he could. He started talking about noble privilege before I'd said a single word to him. He invoked the old rules of war, the ones about ransom and comfortable captivity for a captured lord of rank. He warned me that killing him would bring the full weight of imperial retaliation down on my head. I let him finish, mostly out of curiosity about how far a man will talk when he's already lost. Then I explained, in the coldest voice I had left after watching 5 of my soldiers die for one assassin's ambition, the actual state of things. The calculus behind sparing puppet lords had expired the moment Golden Lion and the Emperor decided to treat me as an outlaw regardless of how correctly I behaved. There was no longer any profit in playing the obedient vassal for an empire that had already written me down as a rebel. Keeping him alive bought me nothing anymore. I don't keep unprofitable assets around out of sentiment. I gave the order for his execution on the spot. No tribunal, no ceremony, no letter to the capital asking permission. It was, in every way that mattered, the last real resistance the old northern nobility had left in them. After that, the rest of the territory folded the way wet paper folds. I left the occupation paperwork to Reen. He is better at ledgers and garrison rotations than I have patience for. I rode back to Greywood alone with my thoughts and a headache that hadn't gone away since the pistol shot. The road gave me nothing to do but replay those 2 seconds of adhesive and glue over and over. Every mile of it I found some new detail to second guess, the angle of the dart, the width of the smoke, the half second I'd spent deciding which vial to throw first. By the 3rd hour I'd stopped bothering to count the mile markers at all. Sylvie was waiting on the mansion steps when I arrived. I could tell from the state of her horse that she hadn't slept in at least a day. Its flanks were lathered white, and it stood with its head low, blowing hard through its nose. Word of the assassination attempt had reached her mid-deployment somewhere north of the river. She'd apparently ridden through the night without stopping to eat. She came down the steps fast. Before I could get a word out, she was on one knee in the courtyard dirt, head bowed. She asked for whatever punishment I thought fit for failing to be at my side when a 4th-tier killer walked into arm's reach of me. I looked at her for a second too long before I moved. The sight of her that shaken was not something I had a ready category for. I pulled her back up by the arm before she could finish the second sentence of her apology. I told her I was fine, which was mostly true by then. I told her that nobody schedules an assassination attempt around her leave rotation. I was trying to lighten the mood more than anything. What came out of my mouth was that from now on she basically couldn't leave my side even to use the washroom. I meant it as a joke. It did not land as a joke. Something in her expression cracked open, guilt and relief, and something else underneath both of those. She said in words I won't repeat exactly because she wasn't fully in control of them, that she would become the shield standing between me and every blade for the rest of her life. I heard the air around her change before I understood what I was watching. It carried a pressure to it, faint but unmistakable, like a storm deciding where to break. Whatever wall had kept her locked at 3rd tier for months broke apart right there on the mansion steps. Some barrier inside her gave way under the weight of guilt and devotion, and a throwaway joke she'd apparently decided was a vow. She rose to 4th tier in front of me. No training hall, no months of grinding, no ceremony. Just a courtyard and a sentence I hadn't meant as anything more than a way to stop her crying. I stood there holding the reins of my own horse, genuinely at a loss for the first time in longer than I could remember. Apparently this world's power ladder runs less on discipline and repetition than it does on how hard a heart happens to break in a given moment. That is a completely useless variable to plan around. I filed that thought away with the rest of the day's lessons, poured myself something stronger than tea, and decided the paperwork on firearms production could not wait another week. From the upper floor of the mansion I stood at the window and watched Serena's face. Frost had already crept across the glass in a thin lattice. I had to angle my head to see past it. I did not need to follow her line of sight to know what held it. She had seen everything Sylvie had just done on the steps below. Sylvie's fourth-tier breakthrough had cracked the courtyard stone straight through to the frost line beneath it. The crack ran in a single jagged seam. It was wide enough that a hand could have fit inside it. Frost climbed the walls in branching lines, thin as veins. It spread upward past the height of a man. Even from the window I could hear the stone still settling. Small ticks and cracks faded into silence one by one. I counted 3 before I stopped bothering. The power itself was not the thing worth studying. Power fades from memory quickly enough once the display ends. What stayed with me was the look on Sylvie's face when she rose out of the wreckage. Dust and frost still clung to her shoulders. She did not brush either away. She turned toward the mansion door before she turned anywhere else. Toward me specifically, before she so much as checked her own hands for injury. I found that detail worth more than the crack in the stone. A woman who could shatter courtyard stone and still looked for permission before she looked for blood on her own palms was not a soldier anymore. Serena had known Sylvie since they were children. Back then Sylvie had been a proud and stubborn family guard. She had obeyed orders and little else beyond them. Whatever stood in that courtyard now had grown out of that girl. It no longer resembled her. Serena recognized the change faster than most people in Greywood would have. She understood, watching from above, that what she saw had stopped being loyalty in any ordinary sense of the word. It read closer to devotion owed to a monarch than anything owed to an employer. Serena's mind cataloged that distinction the way she cataloged most things. Without warmth, without drama, with clinical precision. A small private pang moved through her at the thought of where that left her. She was the older sister. She had arrived late to a stage her younger brother already commanded without contest. The window fogged slightly with her breath. She wiped it clear with 2 fingers before the thought had even finished forming. She set the feeling aside the way she set aside every inefficient emotion. She filed it under matters not currently profitable to dwell on, and she left it there. Serena had never been built to ride as a passenger on anyone's success. Mine included. She was not about to start now, not at her age, not after everything she had already built with her own hands. If military strength and political leverage already belonged to me, then her value would have to be carved out somewhere I had not yet claimed. She decided that much sitting alone at her window. This was before she had even turned back to her desk. The economic front stood open, wide and largely unclaimed. She turned from the window back to her desk. The internal affairs reports from Greywood's staff waited there in neat stacks. The stacks were taller than usual that week. She went through them the way she went through everything, without skimming. Candlelight caught the edges of the paper. It threw long shadows across the ledger stacked beside them. The steam engine trials still stalled out under their own vibration. More often than not, the engines failed before they completed a single full cycle without breaking down. Precision machined parts came back from the workshops inconsistent, batch to batch. Each part was close enough to the last one to pass a glance. It was never identical under real measurement. The flintlock pistols I had proven on the training grounds were, on paper, a weapon that could redraw a battlefield. On paper they promised a kind of advantage no Southern army would see coming. In practice they were slow to produce, one at a time by hand, with no shortcut available. They were expensive to forge. They were impossible to make in the numbers that would actually matter in a war. Greywood had brilliant blueprints and no precision machining capability worth the name. Copperhammer's hammer and eye could only stretch so far against tolerances measured in hairs, no matter how skilled his hands were. Serena read through 3 more reports before she found the shape of the gap she was looking for. She read slowly, the way she always read when a problem had not yet shown her its true edges. Her quill sat untouched beside the inkwell for most of that hour. There was nothing yet worth writing down. The missing piece was not another blueprint. It was not another furnace, either, however much furnace capacity Greywood lacked. It was a kind of hands that this world did not sell in any northern market, at any price. Dwarven craftsmen were spoken of the way people speak of things they assume are half legend. They achieved precision metalwork without a single measuring tool, judged by eye and feel alone. Their tolerances came closer than anything a northern forge produced. Most of them lived reclusive in southern mountain communities that no caravan route touched. The rest ended up as property in the households of southern nobles, worked like tools rather than treated as people. Ordinary trade contacts had no path to either group. Not through money offered honestly, and not through requests made politely, however patiently either approach was tried. Serena had something ordinary traders did not. She had the Cathedral of Holy Light's cover and cargo strange enough to open doors that gold alone could not open. The compass I had put into production was not just a profitable export to her. It was a key shaped for a very specific lock. She intended to find out which door it fit. She understood, sitting there with the reports spread across her desk, that she did not need my permission to test whether that key turned. I had told her before that the southern trade route was not ready. She had not forgotten it. She had simply decided the statement did not cover what she intended to bring back. Her plan formed with the clean, private satisfaction of someone building something meant to be handed over finished, rather than proposed half-built. She would go south. She would find what needed finding. She would set it on the table only once it was already hers to give, not before. Part of it was strategy, a genuine gift measured in exactly the currency I valued. Part of it was something closer to pride. It was the wish to prove that a Bohemia woman could grow this family's fortune, not only guard what past generations had already built. She began drafting a manifest before the ink on the internal affairs reports had even dried. 6 days later I stood in the southern supply plaza of Greywood. The morning cold bit at the back of my throat with every breath, dry and sharp. Frost had crusted the plaza cobbles overnight, and my boots found no purchase where the ice had thickened. I watched the last of her preparations come together in the cold morning light. 20 heavy 4-wheeled carriages sat lined in the plaza. Their wheels were already crusted with the first packed snow of the season. Brass windproof lamps filled crates lashed along the carriage beds. Blocks of smokeless fuel sat beside them, next to bundled northern furs meant to turn heads at any southern market. Sample steel farm tools rode in another set of crates. They were practical goods, meant to open conversations before anyone learned what else traveled with them. The most valuable cargo of all sat apart from the rest. A shockproof case held roughly 100 of my newly finished precision nautical compasses. They were wrapped and cushioned like something closer to relics than instruments. Serena had assigned her most trusted people to ride beside that particular carriage. I noted the choice without needing to ask why. A priest and 3 nuns from the Cathedral of Holy Light stood near the lead carriage. Their robes carried the cold well, though their breath still fogged thick in front of their faces. They held a donation order that was, as far as any inspecting lord would find, entirely genuine. No southern noble collecting tolls along that road would risk the church's displeasure over a wagon of furs and farm tools. Not over that, whatever else might be riding underneath them. 20 of my Iron Guard's finest waited near the rear of the column. They were dressed down in unmarked mercenary gear that hid exactly how dangerous they were. They looked, to any casual eye, like hired swords a merchant house had scraped together for the road. That was precisely the impression Serena wanted them to leave. I walked the line of carriages once, checking lashings and axles out of habit rather than doubt. My gloved hand ran along one rope line out of old instinct, testing its give. I found her people had already done the work properly. Every strap was set, every axle sound. Serena met me near the front of the column, wrapped in furs against the cold. Her breath showed white with every word she spoke. I told her I had known she would not sit still a single extra day once the compass line started running at full output. She answered that watching Sylvie master the northern front had sharpened her appetite for a front of her own. Watching me handle the rest of it done the same. She said she had fought her war here in the north for my sake. She had stood behind ledgers and supply lines while I stood behind soldiers. The south, she said, was where she meant to fight hers now, on her own terms. My tone shifted before I decided to let it. The businesslike register slipped for a moment into something closer to warning. I told her that southern nobles and their merchant alliances did not fight the way northern armies fought. They did not fight out in the open, where a blade could be seen coming. Their traps lived inside contracts and tariffs, buried in clauses no one read twice. A signature could kill a venture as thoroughly as a sword could kill a man. Serena took the warning the way she took most warnings aimed at her competence. She took it with a raised chin and a confidence I recognized, because I owned a version of it myself. She said she would like to see the merchant alive who could out-negotiate her at a bargaining table, southern or otherwise. I let the boast stand. Arguing further would have cost more than it earned. Some lessons only land once they have already drawn blood, and I was not going to be the one to draw it early. Instead, I reached into my coat and drew out a pocket watch. Its case was engraved with the Bohemia flower crest, cold from the morning air. I pressed it into her gloved hand. I lowered my voice, not for effect, but because what came next was meant for her alone. It was not meant for the column of guards and priests standing around us. I told her that if she ever ran into trouble down south that money could not buy off, she was not to hesitate. If words could not argue it away, and force could not break through it, the calculation was already decided. She was not to waste a single minute weighing the cargo against her own safety. Every carriage in that column did not add up to a fraction of what her life was worth to this family. Everything riding inside them, compasses included, weighed less than her safe return. I told her plainly that if she came home breathing, I would personally bring cannons south myself. I would collect back anything we lost, down to the last coin, and let the South learn what that cost them. For a moment something moved behind her composed expression. It was the kind of feeling she usually kept locked as tightly as I kept mine. She covered it fast, the way we both did. She turned the pocket watch over once in her palm before tucking it inside her coat. Her thumb lingered on the engraved crest a heartbeat longer than the motion required. She told me to keep enough space clear in the family warehouse. She intended to fill it with more gold than I had learned to expect from her. I let her have the joke. I understood exactly what it was covering. Some doors are better left closed a while longer between siblings. She did not tell me, then or in any of the words we exchanged that morning, what she truly intended to bring back from beyond the southern border. I had no reason yet to suspect that her ambition reached past trade goods and compasses towards something rarer. Something living, something no caravan manifest would ever list by name. She kept that particular ledger closed. She filed it away for the day she could set it finished on my desk rather than half-formed in conversation. Serena swung up onto her horse with the ease of someone who had spent more of her life managing ledgers than saddles. She still managed to look like she belonged there, chin level, rein steady. She looked down the line of carriages, priests, nuns, and disguised soldiers. She gave the order to move out in a voice that carried without needing to rise. Wheels groaned against packed snow as the column began its slow roll toward Greywood's south gate. The priest's litany carried faint on the wind. It mixed with the creak of axles and the low murmur of guards checking their gear one last time. I stood at the edge of the plaza and watched the carriages pass through the gate one by one. Furs and fuel bricks and farm tools and 100 compasses rode packed tight in shockproof crates. Somewhere inside that column rode faith used as armor. Firepower rode disguised as mercenary swagger. An ambition my sister had not yet named out loud to anyone rode there too, unspoken, unlisted, unclaimed. The gate swallowed the last carriage. The column shrank into a dark thread against the white hills beyond Greywood's walls. Snow had already started falling again, by the time the thread of wagons disappeared over the first ridge. It was swallowed into hills the color of unwritten pages. I stood there longer than the cold gave me any good reason to. My breath rose in slow clouds and dissolved before I could count more than a few of them. I watched the place where the column had vanished as if it might still show me something. The plaza behind me had gone quiet, the last stable hands and porters drifting back toward the warmth of the mansion. Serena did not know yet what the South actually held for her. She did not know whether dwarven hands were as easy to buy as she believed, or guarded by something sharper than tariffs. I did not know yet what she was truly reaching for beneath the furs and the compasses and the donation papers. I only knew it was something she had chosen not to hand me in advance. Both of us were walking into territory neither of us had finished mapping. She was on the road south, and I was standing at a gate watching her go. Whatever she found down there would not stay hidden from me forever. Whatever she was quietly building toward, it would surface eventually on her own timing, if not on mine. For now the snow kept falling, the hills kept their silence, and the answer to both questions rode somewhere south of Greywood, still out of reach of either of us.